The origin myth: retirement was always 65. The modern story says retirement is a finish line at 65, the gold watch, the hammock, the cruise brochures. But that age wasn't discovered by doctors or economists. It was set by politicians. In 1889, Otto von Bismarck launched one of the world's first old-age insurance systems for German workers. The retirement age, 70, set for political stability, not medical science. He set it as a political tool to calm labor unrest and blunt socialist movements, not because human bodies hit a magic wall. Later, in 1916, Germany dropped it to 65. That number sounded humane and tidy. It also kept most of the cost theoretical because life expectancy then made it a promise few would collect for long. To understand how that logic crossed the Atlantic, we need to look at 1935. The United States passed Social Security and locked in age 65 as the eligibility line. Here's the catch. Average life expectancy for American men was around 58 at the time, making widespread long retirements unlikely. That didn't mean people keeled over at 58. High infant mortality dragged the average down, but it did mean the mass of workers wouldn't collect for decades. The program's math relied on a narrow window of payout. Politically smart, actuarially cautious, culturally powerful. This is where the golden years story started to harden into identity. The promise of rest after a lifetime of labor became a national myth, helped along by advertising and post-war prosperity. Employers leaned into it, retirement framed as a reward, a destination, a certainty. But beneath the postcards, two truths held steady. First, retirement age was never a scientific threshold. Second, the system assumed a short period of benefit and a long period of contribution. Meanwhile, pre-1920s America didn't really do retirement. People worked until they couldn't. Pensions existed, but mostly as a status perk for select workers. Railroads, big manufacturers, public employees. For everyone else, family filled the gap. Multi-generational households were the safety net. If you were lucky, a fraternal organization or union pooled risks. If you weren't, you kept going. Then came the 20th century's corporate age. Big employers offered defined benefit pensions to recruit and retain workers. The bargain was simple on paper. You give us your prime years, we'll guarantee income later. That's where the retirement myth fused with an employment contract. The watch at 65 meant something because the check arrived every month. Critically, the employer carried the investment risk and the longevity risk. If markets stumbled or you lived longer than expected, it was their problem, not yours. A structure later research shows is far more efficient at turning savings into lifetime income. But promises are easy to make and expensive to keep. By the 1970s, inflation hammered assets, global competition squeezed margins, and pension underfunding became a boardroom migraine. The math shifted, the myth stayed. Before that pivot, the cultural reinforcement machine got busy. Magazines sold the idea of golf communities and tranquil sunsets. Financial marketers pitched planning your golden years as a product category. And because Social Security's eligibility age seemed like a fixed star, people built life scripts around it. College, career, house, kids, retire at 65. The dependency baked into wages and expectations grew. Instead of negotiating for higher pay today, workers often accepted benefits that arrived decades later, benefits priced and controlled by someone else. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. When a system defines 65 as the finish line, it shapes everything. Savings targets, healthcare timing, even identity. But that number is political, not physiological. What happens when the politics change? What happens when inflation bites, markets move, or lifespans lengthen unevenly across classes and regions? The answer is chaos at the margins and quiet erosion in the middle. Consider a micro-story. A factory foreman in 1962 turns 65, gets the cake, the watch, and a pension check that shows up like rent, reliable, boring, guaranteed. His grandson turns 65 in 2024 and opens a retirement portal. Instead of a paycheck, he sees a pile subject to fees, taxes, and markets. Same retirement age, completely different risk. To understand the 401k hype that replaced pensions, we need the pension wars. But the seed for all of it was planted back in those numbers. 70 in 1889, 65 in 1916, 65 in 1935, with life expectancy at 58. Politicians drew a line that served short-term stability. Culture turned that line into destiny. Corporations wrapped it in benefits language. And families planned their entire lives around a date that could move with a pen. What nobody told the average worker was that retirement is a cash flow problem wrapped in a story. If someone else controls the cash flow, the story works. If you control it, every hidden cost and policy change flows through you. The myth sounds the same, the math doesn't. So when you hear retire at 65, hear the history humming underneath. It's a policy artifact, not a promise. It was never designed around your body, your job, or your region's cost of living. It was designed around budgets and politics. And it set up the grand pivot that would come later, when corporations realized they could keep the retirement story while handing you the bill. While that was happening in boardrooms, another shift was brewing in Washington's tax code, a small provision that would become a very big door. And when a consultant walked through it in 1980, the age-old bargain between employer and worker changed without a vote. Pensions versus 401k, a quiet corporate pivot. 3 days earlier in our story, a different kind of cake was being cut in a boardroom, not a break room. The CFO slid a chart across the table. Pension liabilities, marked in red, climbed like a bad fever. Investment returns whipsawed. Actuaries argued about life expectancies. Every swing in markets hit the company's balance sheet. Meanwhile, competitors overseas didn't carry the same promise. The conclusion in that room was simple. This risk had to move off the books. Defined benefit pensions were a promise first and a portfolio second. The company guaranteed a monthly check based on your years of service and salary. If markets fell or you lived to 95, they absorbed it. That guarantee shaped whole careers. People stayed for the pension, tolerated bad bosses, and planned lives around a check that arrived like clockwork. It worked until the 197s snarled the math. High inflation eroded assets. Accounting rules forced clearer reporting. Underfunding lawsuits began to bite. ERISA in 1974 laid out guardrails, disclosures, and funding standards, which were necessary, but they also exposed just how expensive those promises really were. While that was happening in New York and Detroit, something small flickered in Washington's tax code. In 1978, Congress passed the Revenue Act with a footnote. Section 401k meant to limit executive cash-deferred perks. It wasn't drafted as a national retirement system. It was a technical fix. But in 1980, a benefits consultant named Ted Benna read it differently. He saw a way for regular employees to defer a slice of their wages, pre-tax, and for employers to match those contributions. He tested the idea, got the IRS to bless it in 1981, and then the door swung open. What started as a clever interpretation became a template. Here's where the pivot locked in. With a 401k, the promise flips. Instead of "we'll pay you X for life," it becomes "we'll deposit Y today. Good luck." The market risk and longevity risk move from the company to the worker. For the CFO, it's magic. No giant pension liability sitting on the balance sheet. No guarantees tied to market cycles. Just a defined contribution expense they can dial up or down each year. The volatility that once spooked investors now disappears into millions of individual accounts. Get this, pensions weren't just emotionally comforting, they were financially efficient. When a plan pools risk across thousands of people and invests at institutional costs, it squeezes more income from every dollar. Studies have shown that, on average, defined benefit pensions are roughly 49% more cost-efficient than 401ks, meaning workers need far less saving to reach the same income. That gap isn't a rounding error. It's the difference between retiring with a paycheck versus managing a portfolio you don't have time to babysit. But that efficiency lived at the plan level, not the corporate P&L, and not on the glossy benefits brochure. On paper, ERISA tried to keep companies honest. Fund the plan, disclose the shortfalls, hire fiduciaries. In practice, it also pushed companies to look for cleaner ways to provide benefits without the open-ended liability. Consultants arrived with playbooks. Convert the pension to a cash balance plan, freeze accruals, offer a generous-sounding 401k match, and talk about ownership and flexibility. The pension stayed for a few legacy workers. New hires, they got a plan that looked modern, individualized, and, critically for the company, controllable. Meanwhile, employees heard a different story. The 401k wasn't sold as a cost cut. It was sold as empowerment. Choose your funds, set your pace, watch compounding work for you, and the match sounded like free money, which it is if you capture it. But notice the fine print, vesting schedules that keep you tethered for years, matches that ratchet down in tight quarters, menus curated by vendors who earn fees from the funds you pick. The corporate expense is tax-deductible, predictable, and PR-friendly. The risks live in your login. There's a human moment here that explains how quickly it spread. In 1982, a mid-level manager in a manufacturing firm gets a memo. We're modernizing our retirement benefits. The pitch centers on empowerment. The fine print locks in a risk transfer. He's told the pension is being frozen and replaced with a 401k featuring a 50% match on the first 6%. He runs the math on the back of an envelope and thinks that sounds generous. He doesn't see the actuarial tables that once guaranteed his income for life. He sees a number on a pay stub rising faster if he contributes more. He signs the form. Across the street, another company sees that acceptance rate and copies it. Within a decade, the default in corporate America shifts. What nobody knew at the time was how the mechanics would compound. Every worker now had to become an investor, a tax planner, and a risk manager. Some would thrive. Most wouldn't have the time, temperament, or access to low-cost options. Wall Street saw a river of sticky assets fed automatically by payroll. Employers saw a benefit they could brag about without betting the company. The quiet pivot was complete. This was the moment everything changed. The retirement story stayed the same, but the contract underneath it flipped. And to make it stick, it needed a sales force with perfect timing and perfect slogans. How Wall Street sold the dream. While that boardroom pivot was taking shape, another machine warmed up across town, slicker suits, brighter pitch decks, and a brand new product to scale. Wall Street didn't invent the 401k, but it turned a footnote into a movement. The narrative was simple and irresistible. Set it and forget it. The power of compounding. Own your future. And with every paycheck, money flowed, predictable, automatic, and sticky. Here's where it gets clever. Mutual fund companies realized this wasn't just another retail fad. Payroll deferrals meant dollar cost averaging on autopilot. No cold calls, no churn. Assets that stuck around for decades. Marketing teams rolled out brochures with growth charts arcing to the right, always smooth, never jagged. They featured couples on beaches and executives smiling at dashboards. You're in control, they said, while quietly curating the menu you could control. Employers became co-marketers. They dangled the match like candy. 50 cents on the dollar up to a set percentage. Free money if you showed up, but they tied it to vesting cliffs, 3 years, 5 years, handcuffs that saved companies money when people left early. Consultants taught HR teams how to frame it. We're investing in you. Meanwhile, the actual investment options often came from the same firms advising the plan, earning fees at multiple layers. The fund's expense ratio, distribution fees, revenue sharing baked into share classes that never made it into the TV commercial. Then came the masterstroke, defaults. Auto-enrollment sounded like a kindness because it was. Behavioral finance says people procrastinate, so auto-enroll them at 3% or 6%. Give them a target date fund by birth year so they don't freeze on fund choices. Participation rates jumped. Assets surged. But that default wasn't neutral. It funneled billions into target date funds managed by the very companies designing the menu. It locked in fee streams at scale and hid the real cost under a tidy single ticker. The slogans kept you calm. Time in the market beats timing the market. True enough in isolation. The power of compounding. Also true if the compounding isn't clipped by 1% here, 0.75% there, and trading costs you never see. The fee machine needed silence to work. So the industry sold peace of mind, not price tags. Prospectuses disclosed costs in fine print. Quarterly statements showed balances, not what you could have had without the drag. Micro story, a young engineer starts in 1999. Auto-enrolled at 3%, target date 2040 fund, expense ratio north of 0.9%. He thinks he's doing it right. 20 years later, he's paid tens of thousands more in fees than if he'd had a 0.05% index alternative. He never noticed, because the statements never showed the missing compounding, only the number that did grow, just slower. Sales didn't stop at funds. Record keepers and plan advisors pitched holistic solutions, managed accounts with another 0.3% layered on, advice tools that steered people toward in-house products, share classes that looked identical but paid different trails to intermediaries, even cash sweep accounts inside plans yielding a trickle to participants while generating spreads for providers. None of this was illegal, it was just profitable. And with every payroll run, the flywheel spun faster. Meanwhile, fund families launched glossy education campaigns, lunch and learns at the office, retirement calculators with optimistic return assumptions and understated fee impacts. The message was always, save more, stay the course, trust the model. Rarely, benchmark your plan's fees, ask for institutional share classes, or demand a low-cost index core. When employees did ask, they hit a maze, plan sponsors deferring to consultants citing fiduciary process, providers offering comparable options that kept revenue sharing intact. What nobody knew at the time was how defaults would shape outcomes during stress. Auto-escalation pushed contributions up annually, which was good, but default funds often carried glide paths that assumed gentle markets and low inflation. When volatility clustered, rebalancing happened mechanically inside products you couldn't dissect, at costs you couldn't see. The very simplicity that solved inertia also insulated providers from scrutiny. There's a human beat that shows the psychology at work. A new hire logged in. The portal congratulates them. You're on track. Confetti animation. A slider suggests bumping contributions by 1% to unlock thousands more by retirement. It's persuasive. It never asks, are you paying 1% too much for these returns? It never says, the cheapest fund here could save you a car's worth of fees by midlife. The language rewards action, not selection. Employer matches play double duty. They sweeten the offer and mask the shift from pensions. In surveys, workers pointed to the match as proof the company cared. In budgets, companies netted the match against pension savings and balance sheet relief. The match was real money, the optics were even better. And with vesting cliffs, a chunk of that spend never left. Finally, the consolidation era sealed the dream. Big providers bought smaller record keepers, cross-sold proprietary funds into captive menus, and used scale to dominate plan lineups. Assets under management ballooned. Costs per participant fell on paper, yet many plans still featured expensive active funds because revenue sharing subsidized administrative fees. The system presented itself as modern, efficient, and personalized. In practice, it was industrial. Streams of small fees on massive, predictable flows. Set it and forget it worked brilliantly for them. For you, it depended on whether you noticed the costs hidden under percentages, huge damage. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside those glossy portals, quiet, constant, and devastating over time. Fees, dressed up as expense ratios, service charges, and advice, shaved your future in basis points that felt harmless. 0.1% here, 1% there. Harmless until decades pass. Start with the obvious layer. Fund expense ratios. That's the sticker price. In many plans, especially at small employers, core funds charge 0.75% to 1.5% annually. Low-cost index funds exist at 0.05% or less, but they're not always offered or they're buried. Then come the distributor tolls, 12B1 fees, marketing charges embedded in the fund's cost. Add revenue sharing, where certain share classes kick back a slice to the record keeper to offset admin costs. None of that shows up as a line item on your statement. It's baked into performance, invisibly nibbling your compounding. Now layer in wrap fees. Some providers slot funds into a group annuity wrapper, adding mortality and expense charges on top of the fund's own costs. Same stocks underneath, higher toll to access them. Managed accounts tack on another 0.25% to 0.75% for personalization that often mirrors target date allocations you already own. Advice fees can be worth it when they solve real problems, but when they steer you into house funds paying trails back to the platform, it's not advice, it's distribution. Here's where the math bites. Over 30 years, a 1.5% annual drag versus 0.05% can mean roughly $240,000 less in your pocket, even with the same contributions and market returns, a life-changing sum lost to fees alone. That's not a luxury sedan. That's a decade of groceries, a mortgage cushion, or 5 extra years of part-time work you didn't want. Compounding doesn't care whether it lifts your balance or the provider's revenue. It just compounds. There's a hidden toll at the trading desk, too. Mutual funds pass along transaction costs you never see, bid-ask spreads, market impact, turnover. Active funds chase returns and trade more, which adds friction you don't control. Even cash inside your plan can be a profit center for someone else. Stable value or cash sweep options often credit you a slim yield while the spread goes to the provider. In low-rate years, that spread is quiet. In high-rate years, it's loud. But you won't hear it unless you look. Record keepers and plan advisors take slices as well. They earn asset-based fees per participant charges or both. Asset-based sounds small, but when it's 0.30% on a growing pool, the dollars balloon. Revenue sharing lets employers say, we don't pay plan fees because participants pay them inside funds. It's legal. It's also the reason you sometimes see two nearly identical funds, same benchmark, same manager, but one is mysteriously more expensive. That extra cost is buying someone's lunch, not your retirement. Microstory, Maya, a nurse, contributed faithfully for 20 years. Her plan's core equity fund charged 0.98% plus a 0.25% 12B1 fee. She didn't know cheaper institutional index shares at 0.04% existed. When her hospital switched record keepers, she discovered the low-cost lineup. 5 years later, her balance grew faster with the same markets and contributions. Nothing changed, except who collected the compounding. Fiduciary rules are supposed to police this. ERISA says plan sponsors must act in participants' best interest, prudent, loyal, cost-conscious. In practice, fiduciary latency is common. Committees meet, minutes get taken, and lineups get tweaked, but revenue sharing and pay-to-play fund menus often linger, especially in small and mid-sized plans where employers lean on bundled providers. Lawsuits have helped at the margins, pushing some plans toward cheaper share classes and index cores. But litigation trims the hedges. It doesn't uproot the fee garden. Here's a quiet conflict. Menus curated by vendors that also manage the funds on the shelf. When a recordkeeper's affiliate fund sits next to a cheaper competitor, guess which one shows up as the default in the model portfolio? Target date funds, the default of defaults, concentrate assets into a single ticker that blends stocks and bonds with a glide path you can't unpack. The convenience is real. So are the embedded fees. Two target date series can differ by nearly a full percentage point. Over a career, that's 6 figures of difference for doing the exact same. Set it and forget it. This is the moment everything changes when you see it. Fees don't feel like risk. Volatility shouts, fees whisper. But a whisper, repeated every year for 40 years, outshouts any bear market you'll face. Markets recover. Fees don't refund. What can you actually do from inside the machine? First, find the lowest cost index options that track broad markets, U.S. total stock, international U.S. bond, ideally under 0.10%. Second, check share classes. Institutional shares are cheaper than retail twins. Third, ask HR for a fee disclosure that lists every layer, fund expenses, admin, record keeping, advice, and any revenue sharing. If the lineup is stuffed with expensive active funds and high-cost target dates, press for competitive bids from low-cost providers. Employers respond when enough employees ask precise questions. One more human beat. A teacher logs in, flips a toggle from a 0.85% target date fund to a 0.04% index trio with the same allocation. She changes nothing else. 10 years later, she's tens of thousands ahead, not because she picked winning stocks, but because she stopped paying to lose. Quiet action, loud compounding. Set it and forget it only works if what you've set is cost-aware. Otherwise, you're compounding someone else's retirement.